All right, we're talking about the Pipeline and Informed Planning Alliance. I think for the last 4 or 5 years during the Pipeline Safety Trust Conference, we've had a session that talks about PIPA. That's the acronym for it. And so we're going to have another food for thought, a short kind of point counterpoint. It's not going to be quite point counterpoint, I don't think. But I'm going to do the first session, and my side of the argument is PIPA dead because of its inability to address the real issues. I actually was going to call it, it's done, stick a fork in it, but I thought that was a little too out there. And so I'm going to go through a little bit. First of all, I'm assuming there's some people in the room who probably don't know what PIPA is. And as I said, it's the Pipeline and Informed Planning Alliance. It was an effort that was done a number of years ago. There's a number of people in the audience who were part of that. You know, over 100 individuals, I think it was more like 150 individuals from all kinds of different stakeholder groups, excavators, the home builders, commercial developers, the industry, the public, a variety of regulators, came together to look at ways to start coming up with recommendations mainly for local government and landowners on how to think about risk of pipelines, new development along existing pipelines. And in the end, we came up with 46 kind of consensus-based recommendations for those types of groups to think about when development is happening around pipelines. The impetus for this was really what we saw around the country is, for the most part, the pipeline industry had worked pretty hard to put their pipelines in kind of undeveloped rural areas. And if you look at that slide on the left, that's a pipeline in Washington State the way it looked in, I think it's 1990. And then the slide on the right is the exact same aerial photograph 10 years later. And this wasn't unique. We're seeing this all over the country, not only housing developments, but schools, shopping malls, and all kinds of things being built near where pipelines were first. The pipeline was there, they had a right of way, and the development encroached up near the pipeline. So there was a number of different governmental studies that had identified this as a problem, and that was what the impetus of PIPA was, to bring people together to talk about how do we deal with the risk of new development around pipelines. A number of, I'm not going to go through the 46 recommendations, and I'm not going to put up the whole list on there and talk you to death or death by PowerPoint, but some of the main ones, and I'll just use this as an example, is the idea of a consultation zone. And there was different zones, whether it was a natural gas pipeline or a liquid pipeline, and basically it was a zone where, you know, a local government, if they wanted to adopt something like that, could require a developer or a property owner and the pipeline company to at least talk to each other when development was going to occur within that zone, so they had an idea of what was going on and addressed the different risks. So that's PIPA in a very small nutshell, and a number of us will be around if anybody wants more information about that. I'm just going to go through real quickly why we think PIPA is kind of in trouble at this point and how the whole thing is stalled. So one of the reasons, and I'm going to have a few of them here, PIPA is supposed to be a risk-informed based effort that really depends on providing risk information to local governments and landowners. The problem we've seen in the last couple of years is a lot of the information has to come from the industry, and the industry does not yet seem prepared to use the word risk and the word pipeline in the same sentence. It kind of goes counter to what they've been saying, that pipelines are the safest way to move fuel, which is true, but if you want to talk to local governments, you also have to talk about the risk. So that's one of the problems that kind of is an overarching thing, and we spent way too much time in the last year having an argument about whether you can use the word risk and the word pipeline in the same sentence. One of the other reasons PIPA seems to have stalled is the recommendations rely way too much on the pipeline companies proactively providing education to developers and property owners. I mean, this made a lot of sense when we were coming up with this, but as we move forward, you know, there's not a whole lot of incentive for a pipeline company to spend their valuable time talking to property owners about stuff outside of their right-of-way. It's kind of outside of their authority, like you've heard the regulators say, we don't have authority for that. Well, outside of the right-of-way is kind of outside of the pipeline company's authority. And it's been very hard to get them to start talking to property owners about, you know, rearranging the way they're going to do a development, or putting the house a different place, or turning the house around so the picture windows aren't facing where the pipeline might fail. Because then again, you're talking about pipeline risk to a developer, and that's kind of counter to what the pipeline companies often want to talk about. The big elephant in the room, in our mind anyway, where PIPA is really stalled is when you go out and you talk with local planners, they're usually a pretty smart bunch of people. And, you know, PIPA is all about if there's a risk that the local government should pay attention to enough that they should enact an ordinance to control development along existing pipelines, why is there not an equal emphasis in turning that around to address the risk of new pipelines near existing developments? And PIPA took off the table the whole discussion of new pipelines coming through a developed area. And every time we've tried to show that to a local planner, they're smart enough to know, well, if it works this way, why doesn't it work that way? And PIPA shuts down that whole discussion. One of the other reasons is PIPA has no dedicated leadership, funding, or implementation. PHMSA has been trying to do a pretty good job of the whole PIPA thing. They've been trying to keep it alive, but they have a staff person kind of working on it. What PIPA needs to be successful is the same type of effort that's made other things like excavation damage and now some public awareness successful. Common Ground Alliance was an effort similar to PIPA, taken on to deal with excavation damage. They have a $2 million a year budget and a whole staff dealing with just that issue. The Pipeline Association for Public Awareness, which is a fairly recent organization dealing with just public awareness issue, has 387 dues-paying members to create an effort to deal with public awareness. PIPA has nothing like that. The other thing that we've noticed, and I think it's true with big corporations, big federal government, is it's really hard for them to realize that this needs to be a sustained, dedicated effort that makes this happen one community at a time. Every community is different. If you're going to talk to local elected officials and planning people, you need to tailor it to their discussion. There's no magic bullet that we're going to talk to some national planning association and they're going to put a PIPA stamp somewhere and all of a sudden every community in the country is going to all of a sudden adopt planning recommendations for PIPA. We really need to dig in, have a sustained effort that goes one community at a time to make it work. So can we save PIPA? Sure. All we need to do is tweak the recommendations we came up with years ago so they don't rely so much on pipeline operators. We need to address that elephant in the room about new pipelines because as we've heard this week, there's thousands of miles of new pipelines being moved right past people's homes, and that isn't addressed by PIPA. And we need to provide the resources so we can really dig in and get this done like we have with some other major pipeline issues. And now I'll let Christy tell me why I'm full of it.